Hey guys. William Randolph Hearst was a really rich man, and he loved art. He loved collecting art. He had tracked down and purchased many paintings and statues and other works of art, and he had warehouses full of things that he had purchased. He had agents who worked for him. He would tell them of a particular art piece that he wanted, and they would track it down, find out who owned it, and try to acquire it for Hearst. He had a painting in mind once and asked his agents to find it and buy it for him. And after some time, they came back to him and said, "Sir, we found it, we tracked it down, we know where it is." And he says, "Awesome, who owns it?" And they said, "You do. It's in one of your warehouses. You bought it a couple of years ago." He was hunting for something he already had. Now we are beginning our study in Joshua chapter 1. Israel was a very small family group of about 70 people, along with their spouses, descendants of Jacob and their spouses, when they went to Egypt at the end of the book of Genesis. And by the time they left Egypt 400 years later, they were a nation of over 1 million people, possibly as much as 2 million. We know that because right after they left Egypt, they numbered the fighting men. And that was a number that was in excess of 600,000 people. And that was within an age range of, I think it was 20 years old up to whatever. It was the men who were capable of fighting. So if you consider that there are old people who can't fight, and there are women and there are children, you have at least 1.5 million people, and very probably as much as 2 million. And so this was a very, very vast group of people. But technically, they were not yet a nation, because to be a nation, you need several things. You need a king or a ruler of some kind, or a government, laws, whatever, and you need a land. You need a place where you belong. In the wilderness, God established himself as Israel's king, and he gave them his law as their own. So that's two things they need, but they didn't yet have a land. But when they came to enter the land of Canaan that God promised to make their own, then they would have been able to take it, and they would have been a nation. However, at first they rejected this. They said, no, we can't go in, we can't do this, it's too hard. And so they'd had to wander for 40 years in the desert, until everybody 20 years old and upward who had refused to go in died in the wilderness. And now they're back again at the edge of Canaan, about to enter the land, about to be given the land and become a nation. And so when our story begins, Moses, who has been their leader through the 40 years in the desert, has died. And a new leader is being chosen to take them forward into Canaan. I'm going to read for you from Joshua chapter 1, just the first couple of verses. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, "Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then you and all these people get ready to cross the Jordan River into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites." Now imagine what Joshua must have thought. He has been the aide to Moses for 40 years. He knew firsthand exactly what it was like to lead this group of people. He knew the sleepless nights, the work that Moses had carried on his shoulders all these years. The loss of Moses was a huge thing for the nation. His were big sandals to fill. I wonder if Joshua's mouth fell open in disbelief when God said to him, "Now you and all these people, you cross the Jordan and take the land." Joshua has been a variety of things in his life. In Egypt, he was a slave. And then when they came out of Egypt, he was numbered among the fighting men, a soldier. He was a servant, the aide to Moses. He was one of the spies that went into Canaan the first time that they got to the edge of the land, when the spies talked the people out of going. And now Joshua is being named the successor to the greatest leader that has likely ever existed in human history, which is Moses. Imagine the difficulty Joshua faced. We know his reaction because of what God says to him. In verses 5 to 9, 3 times, God tells Joshua to be strong and to be courageous. And then he says, "Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. From that, we know that Joshua was feeling really overwhelmed and fearful at what the Lord had commanded him to do. And really, can you blame him? I've been fearful of things God has asked me to do that were nowhere near as difficult as the task that Joshua faced. His fear is reasonable. This was not going to be easy. He had to lead a group of rebellious, complaining, difficult people of over 1 million strong into a strange land. The land was thoroughly inhabited and heavily fortified. He had to deal with all of their constant decisions and all of the things that they needed done. He had a burden of them on his shoulders. This is huge. But God gave Joshua a promise in verse 5, and it was on the basis of this promise that God told him not to be afraid, but to be courageous. The first part of verse 5 says, "No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life." Now that's awesome. But the rest of the verse says why it is so that Joshua does not have to fear. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. Therefore, be strong and courageous. That's an amazing promise. Now, we take that for granted. We have a similar promise from Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, that says, I will never leave you or forsake you, so that we may say with confidence, I will not fear. But the presence of God was not a given for Joshua. In that period of time, in the Old Testament, the Spirit of God, his presence, came upon certain people for specific tasks or challenges. But there was no general expectation of the presence of God. The Spirit of God did not indwell all of those who had faith in God. It was an amazing gift that God is giving to Joshua here. His presence, always, never to leave him. And this calmed the fears of Joshua. It's the basis of his courage to move forward with the overwhelming task that God himself had given him, the fact that God was going to go with him. God instructs Joshua in a recipe for success. He is to obey the law that has been given to him by Moses, the law of God. He is to meditate on it and do everything written in it. Then, God says, he will prosper and have success. And again, God promises to go with him. Joshua responds with faith and with immediate action. He turns to the people and he sends the officers of the people out among the nation to inform them that they are to get ready, for in 3 days' time they are going to enter the land the Lord has given them and take it as their own. Joshua then turns to the tribes of Reuben and Gad and the half-tribe of Manasseh, who had been granted land on the side of the Jordan River where they were currently standing as their tribal lands. These tribes had made a request to have these lands granted to them prior to the death of Moses, and it had been granted so long as they were willing to go with the other tribes into Canaan and to fight alongside the other tribes until all of the people of Israel had their own territorial lands. This is a risk for these tribes. They are going to leave their families behind on this territory on this side of the Jordan and then go and fight with their brothers for who knows how long. But the confidence Joshua has in the promises of God and the fact that God is going with them is bleeding into the people. And these tribes agree. They say they will do whatever Joshua says. The presence of God casts out fear. What's causing you to fear today? Sometimes in difficulty or stress, we forget that we have the same promises as did Joshua. God has said he will never leave us or forsake us, so we do not have to be afraid. And that is a promise that we can cling to. When I found my husband land dead in our field a few years ago, it was just after I had prepared to teach this for the very first time. And in the teaching time and preparation, that verse, Joshua 1, the last part of verse 9, really stuck in my head. And then just a few days later, Len was killed. And there were times when I was afraid. I didn't know how to run his businesses. I didn't know how to do a lot of things. Suddenly I was forced to do and had to do on my own. But I could hear God say, do not be afraid. Sometimes I felt lonely. I looked at the long years ahead and of loneliness, and it was overwhelming. It was overwhelming to lose someone you've been married to for a really long time. Then God would say, but I am with you. This promise was a rock I clung to for the first 6 months after Len died. How is the promise of God to be with you giving you courage today? What do you need to do to remind yourself that he is with you and will never leave you so you can move forward with confidence? Now let's move into chapter 2. I wish we had time to unpack this story a little bit more fully, but I know it's a familiar one to most of us. Joshua sent 2 spies across the Jordan and into the land to Jericho to check it out. The people of Jericho were on guard, and the spies had to hide. They were a prostitute named Rahab, who lived in a house on the wall of the city, took him into her home, for the people of Jericho were actively hunting for spies that were coming from Israel to check out Jericho. I want to read to you a little bit from chapter 2, starting in verse 8, so you get a sense of what the people of the land are thinking at this time. Chapter 2, verse 8. Before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and said to them, I know that the Lord has given you this land, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to Sihon and Og, the 2 kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted in fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. The presence of God among the nation of Israel, while it was under the leadership of Moses, had been noticed by other nations, by other people groups. The response of the city of Jericho was to fear the Lord and to fear Israel. They expected to be defeated by Israel. But what did the city of Jericho do? They shut up the city. They set a guard. They searched for strangers who might have come in. They prepared to fight even though they thought they would be defeated. They did not ask God to forgive them. They did not repent. They did not seek his mercy. But look at the response of Rahab to the exact same news and understanding of God as she turned to God in faith. Her actions spoke of her new loyalties. She hid the spies on her roof and lied to the guards who searched for them. She asked for rescue when they came to take the city. She sought the mercy of God. Hebrews 11:31 says, by faith, the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient. Both the people of Jericho and Rahab herself had the same information, but they had different responses. Jericho prepared to resist God, to fight even though they thought they would lose. But Rahab sought God's mercy. She turned to God in faith, and she was rescued. God's presence offers mercy and calls for a response of faith. Now, of course, the first response God asks of anyone is that of seeking his mercy for salvation. Have you done that? I don't assume that every good church person who does a Bible study has a personal relationship with Jesus. And if you do not, that is the response that God is seeking from you, first of all. God's presence among his people, his power and protection on their behalf, drew Rahab to faith. How is God's presence visible in your life? Who is being drawn to faith by the visible reality of God in your life? If no one sees that, what sin is dimming the visible presence of God? What fear is keeping you from a demonstration of his character in your life? Seek his mercy for that sin, so his presence will shine through you again. Okay, moving into chapters 3 and 4, this is the account of crossing the Jordan River into Canaan. Joshua had said that they would cross over in 3 days. And the first thing we learned was that they had some things they had to do in those 3 days. They had to be packed and ready to go. They had to watch. So when they saw the ark of the Lord and the priests who carried it moving out, that they were to be ready to get up and follow. But there was one more thing they had to do. It's an instruction given in just 2 words. Consecrate yourselves. That's chapter 3, verse 5. For the Lord will do great things among you tomorrow. Other versions use the word sanctify. Both mean the same thing. Be set apart, purified, be hallowed. The people are being commanded to get themselves right with God before he took them forward. Verse 7 says, the Lord was going to exalt Joshua in the eyes of the people. They would know that the Lord was with Joshua. It was his stamp of the approval of the Lord's presence on him in a visible way, so the people would know the Lord had chosen him to lead, just as the Lord had chosen Moses before him. The ark is to go ahead of the people. This represented the presence of the Lord, since at this time, the presence of the Lord dwelt in the ark, above the box which contained the law, above the mercy seat where the blood of the sacrifice was put, and between the wings of the cherubim. God's visible presence was leading the way. There's a phrase in verse 4 that jumped out to me 4 years ago, again around the time Len died. It said in that verse, after they are told that the ark is to go ahead of them, then you will know which way to go, since you have never been this way before. Now, at that time, I thought of the fact that I was going into a new phase in life that I had never been in before. New things to learn, an adjustment, everything I was familiar with disappearing and changing. I had never lived alone in my entire life prior to Len's death. Israel is going into a land they have never visited. It's unfamiliar territory. It's a little scary, but God is leading the way. They didn't need to know the way. God knew, and he's going with them, going ahead of them. Although Israel was to follow the ark, they had to stay 1,000 yards back. There was distance between the people and the holy presence of God. God was with them, but it was a closeness of some discomfort, for he was holy and they were sinful. For us, the distance is erased, not because we are not sinful, we are, but because we have been forgiven and made righteous by the blood of Jesus. The priests were commanded to walk forward until their feet were in the Jordan, and then God promised to dry up the river. There was a sign, this was a sign of power. This was the time of year when the river was not just flowing as usual, it was the sign of, it was flood season. The river was at flood stage. It was so full of water that it was rushing quickly and had overflowed its banks. Yet even at the time of its greatest power, God promised he would dry up the river. And he did. And this validated for Israel the position of Joshua. God was with him, for what he said God was going to do is exactly what God did. It also was further glorification for the name of the Lord amongst the people of the land. The waters of the river dried right up, standing like a wall or a heap, it says in verse 13, and the people followed the priests into the river. The priests stood in the middle of the Jordan on dry ground till over 1 million people passed them by. Then they came out of the river and the water flowed again. There was one final instruction for the people given prior to their crossing, and this is in chapter 4. Joshua was told to choose 12 men, one from each tribe. And these men were told to pick up a stone from the bottom of the river as they crossed, and to carry it on their shoulder up onto the further bank. These were piled up as a memorial to the Lord. And I'm going to read chapter 4, verses 21 to 24. He said to the Israelites, in the future, when your descendants ask their parents, what do these stones mean? Tell them, Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, For the Lord your God dried up the Jordan before you until you crossed over. The Lord your God did to the Jordan what he had done to the Red Sea when he dried it up before us until we had crossed over. He did this so all the peoples of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord is powerful, and so that you might always fear the Lord your God. God's presence provides guidance and power. Where are you today that you've never been before? Maybe it's a new phase in your life. Your children have gone, moved out, or maybe you're newly widowed, or someone's abandoned you. Maybe you've lost your financial security or are taking on a ministry job that is just massively too big for you. And it's all new ground. What obstacles lie in your path? Barriers to doing what God called you to do? What problems feel insurmountable, like the Jordan River at flood stage? If you're a believer in Jesus, you already have the presence of God. He is with you. He will never leave you. The presence of God provides the comfort, guidance, and power you need to move forward, so you can be courageous about it. Finally, let's have a look at the first 12 verses of chapter 5. So the nations in Canaan heard about the drying of the Jordan. And verse 1 says, their hearts melted with fear and they no longer had courage. But Israel probably didn't know that. They stand now, the people of Israel, in enemy territory. And look at the very first thing the Lord commands them to do. They are to make flint knives and circumcise the Israelites. The people had been circumcised when they left Egypt, but all those 20 years old and older died in the wilderness. And those who stood here on the bank of the Jordan, many of them had been born in the 40 years in the wilderness. The males had not been circumcised. God is demanding their obedience, their sanctification to him prior to moving ahead. But did it strike you as odd that he waited until he had them in enemy territory before he commanded their circumcision? That's a risk. Think about it. All the men are going to be sore for days, unable to fight if needed. They are sitting helpless in enemy territory. It's an act of faith to obey the Lord. God calls this the removal of the reproach of Egypt. But Joshua doesn't hesitate. And so the people are circumcised there in Canaan. They had to trust God to protect them during this very vulnerable time. Then the Lord instructed them on the 14th day of the month to celebrate the Passover. This was a feast that had been first given to them when they left Egypt 40 years ago. They may not have been able to keep the Passover in the wilderness. It would have been difficult to do while they were on the move, and they had nothing to eat but manna for most of those years. But here they were able to keep it, eating of the produce of the land of Canaan. This was a reminder of the power God had shown in the past on rescuing them from slavery in Egypt. They would have praised God for his past deliverance, for his power in giving them passage over the Red Sea, but now also over the Jordan, and for his presence with them as they move ahead to take their new land. On the day after the Passover, the day after they ate of the produce of Canaan for the first time, no manna fell. It stopped. God had proved faithful until they were in a place with abundant food, and then the manna stopped. And so they were consecrated, and they celebrated at Gilgal in Canaan, safe in the presence of the Lord, even though they sat on enemy land. The presence of God calls for sanctification. God cannot live with a person and leave them unchanged. His presence always results in change. It demands change. Where are you hearing God's call on your life for change today? I heard someone say once that God always has his finger on something in our life that he is working on changing. And if you think about it, you probably know what that is. You probably know what his voice has been to you about what habit or thought or attitude in you is wrong and needs change. You know where his spirit is at work. He doesn't ever leave us without something he's working on to change. How are you responding? Does it seem risky? Obedience to God is often risky. Is it going to cost you something? Maybe something you're attached to, or time, or something that is dear to you. Are you willing to trust God and obey? Sometimes, like William Hurst, we seek things we already have. We ask God for guidance, for power, for courage, for peace. But in having God himself, we have everything we need. The God who was with Moses and with Joshua lives with you as a believer in Jesus. You have his presence, not at a distance of 1,000 yards, but inside you, as close as it is possible for him to be. And in having him, you have everything you need. We just need to live as if that is true. How are you living today in the reality of God's presence with you?